Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and in this video I'm going to tell you how to draft a black-green -1/-1 counter deck in triple Amonkhet draft. I do an archetype guide on my own channel before the set is fully released. I do it right after it's spoiled, and it's a good way to think about the set ahead of time. But now that I've actually drafted the format somewhere around 40 times, I can give you an idea based on experience how to draft these decks in the ideal way to draft these decks. And in fact, in the description below I've posted a video of a 3-0 version of a black-green -1/-1 counter deck. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through all of the different cards that you're going to want for this deck to completely pan out and be its strongest. Now, this is a very aggressive format, and it's pretty well known that red-white and red-green and green-white are sort of the best decks in the format because they're so fast. But black-green -1/-1 counters is quite powerful when you really get there, and it can beat those decks because of how powerful it can be. So let's go ahead and jump into talking about the actual cards in Amonkhet in the black and green color pair that support -1/-1 counters. One of the quickest ways of figuring out what a particular color pair wants to do in a limited format is to look at what Wizards calls the signpost uncommons. These are uncommons that are two colors and sort of represent what a particular color pair is about. For black-green in Amonkhet, that uncommon is Decimator Beetle. I think Decimator Beetle is actually the strongest of all of the gold uncommons and the only one I'm willing to first pick in this format. So that's a good place to start with this archetype. It has the best gold card in the format. The Beetle is all about -1/-1 counters. He comes into play and puts one somewhere, whether on himself or somewhere else, and when he attacks, he puts a -1/-1 counter on one of your opponent's creatures. Note, by the way, that the Beetle doesn't have to remove a -1/-1 counter from one of your creatures to put a -1/-1 counter on one of your opponent's creatures. That's a mistake I've seen people make. That's a mistake I made about the card when I looked at it in my initial set review. So the Beetle tells us that this format puts -1/-1 counters, the black and green color pair anyway, puts -1/-1 counters on your own creatures, but it also wants to put them on other creatures. So now that we've sort of talked about this signpost uncommon, let's go ahead and look at what's going on in the rest of the color pair. I'm going to talk about all of the black and green commons and uncommons that involve putting -1/-1 counters places, and I'm going to talk about them in order of how powerful I think they are. Worth noting that I do think all of these cards, all 12 of the ones we're about to talk about, are playable, but I'm going to put them in order of most playable to least playable nonetheless. So let's start with sort of the first tier of uncommons and commons. At the very top, we have Crocodile of the Crossing and Baleful Amonkhet. These are both creatures I feel fine about first picking. Crocodile of the Crossing especially, I think, is just the best card for this color pair in terms of just being a big, aggressive creature who does things with -1/-1 counters. It's not hard to play him as a 4-mana 5/4 with haste. And Baleful Amonkhet is not hard to play as a 3-mana 4/3 with lifelink. They're both the kinds of creatures that on their own can just end games if the opponent doesn't have removal. Baleful Amonkhet, by the way, is especially effective against the aggro decks in the format. Lifelink is a very powerful tool against them because if you just gain a little bit of life, they're going to be in trouble because they run out of gas so quickly because they just have a very low curve and they don't have a way to draw extra cards or anything like that. So these are the two best cards that put -1/-1 counters places. But there's a lot of other pretty good ones too. After that, we have Exemplar of Strength and Splendid Agony. The Exemplar isn't terrible to first pick, but it has sort of underwhelmed me. A lot of the time, it's just a 2-mana 1/1, and then your opponent plays their own 2-mana 2-power creature, and all you end up doing is gaining 1 life and trading with your opponent's creature. Now, it still has the upside that all of these -1/-1 counter creatures have, though, in that you can play it as a 2-mana 4/4 and put the -1/-1 counters somewhere else, and that's a pretty strong effect. Splendid Agony does not put -1/-1 counters on your own creatures, but it's a removal spell, and sometimes you can get a 2-for-1 with it, and it's a good card to have in any black deck, but in this one, you can sometimes get a little more bang for your buck out of it. After sort of the second group, the second two commons and uncommons, we go to the next group, which for me is Soul Stinger and Defiant Greatmaw. Soul Stinger is a card I love. It's a 4-mana 4/5 if you want it to be, which is a great deal. Or it's a 4-mana 2/3 who, when it dies, puts 2 -1/-1 counters on other creatures. Something to keep in mind if you're really deep in this -1/-1 counter deck, sometimes it's right to just kill your Soul Stinger. Just put a bunch of -1/-1 counters on it and he turns into a kill spell, basically, in addition to giving you an oversized creature. Soul Stinger's great. I would play it in any black deck, but you can get the most value out of it here. Defiant Greatmaw, sort of similar to Soul Stinger, not only comes into play with -1/-1 counters, but it comes with some -1/-1 counter synergy. When one or more -1/-1 counters get put on the Great Maw, you can remove them from another one of your creatures. So the Great Maw sort of eats -1/-1 counters off of your opponent's creatures when you put them onto your Great Maw in the first place. So these two cards are great because not only do they put -1/-1 counters somewhere, but they have some extra synergy with them as well. After that, we have Cartouche of Ambition and Ruthless Sniper. These are both cards that put -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures most of the time. I guess you can choose to put them on your own. And they're both pretty good. The Cartouche is quite good. Again, lifelink is one of the good ways of beating the really fast aggro decks in this format, and Cartouche of Ambition does that for you because it gives you lifelink, but it also weakens your opponent's creature. Ruthless Sniper is actually probably stronger than a lot of the cards on this list, but it's actually better off in a blue-black or black-red deck where you have access to even more cycling and cycling payoffs. That said, it's still fine in a deck like this. Even if you only have 5 or 6 cyclers, you'll probably get to do something with it. Next, we have Ordinary Kudu and Festering Mummy. Ordinary Kudu is fine. He's sort of the vanilla bleh version of one of these creatures. All it does is come into play as a 3-mana 3/4, or put 1 counter on one of your creatures, and put 1 counter on one of your creatures, that is. Or it's a 3-mana 2/3 is what is sort of the what you can end up with. Now, Ordinary Kudu is still a pretty good card. I just have it lower than a lot of these more powerful basically versions of Ordinary Kudu, like compare it to Defiant Great Maw, who actually costs the same exact mana, for example. And then there's also Festering Mummy. Festering Mummy is an interesting one because he's not too bad to put -1/-1 counters on, as you can play him early and then put counters on him. And then when he dies, he puts a counter somewhere else. So that's something to keep in mind that the Festering Mummy can do for you. He's not great, though. I don't play him in every version of this deck that I draft. I play him in some of them, though. And then finally, the last 2 cards that put -1/-1 counters on things that I think are the least playable, but still playable, are Stinging Shot, which can only put them on creatures with flying, but it does have cycling, so you can use the cycle effect instead if it doesn't have a target, and Grasping Dunes. I think Grasping Dunes is playable in basically any 17-land deck that's 2 colors, as long as you run 8, 8, and 1 or something like that. It gets a little more dangerous to run in a 16 and especially 15-land deck or in a 3-color deck, and so it's definitely the least playable, but it is actually quite good because it's a land in the early game, and then it can turn into a way to remove a creature or get a -1/-1 counter payoff one way or another. So now that we've seen all these ways of putting -1/-1 counters on things, including your own creatures, I'm going to talk about the cards in this set that are good for putting -1/-1 counters on. We already sort of saw a couple of them, like Soul Stinger and Defiant Great Maw, and Festering Mummy to a lesser extent, but let's look at some of the others. And I'm again going to list them in order of how happy I am to put -1/-1 counters on them. So again, we have Soul Stinger here, just to remind you. I'm often very happy to put -1/-1 counters on him and just kill him, and then kill one of my opponent's creatures with 4 or 5 -1/-1 counters. Doomed Dissenter, though, I think is the next best thing to put counters on, even better than Defiant Great Maw. And this is because it's such an early drop. It's a creature you can play very early, and you sort of get an upgrade if you kill it with -1/-1 counters. Like if you play your Soul Stinger on turn 4 and want it to be a 4/5, you can put the counters on Doomed Dissenter and you just get an upgrade. You get a zombie token that's a 2/2 instead of only having a 1/1 in play. So Doomed Dissenter is great, a very good common for this deck. Other decks don't want it as much. Even the black-white zombie deck doesn't want it. And sometimes you can end up with 4 or 5 copies of Doomed Dissenter in this deck. And when you do, your deck's going to be pretty powerful when you're playing, Crocodiles on turn 4 and getting a zombie out of the deal. Things like that are pretty awesome. But there are other good creatures for putting counters on. One of them is Defiant Great Maw, who we have already mentioned. He makes it so you can remove -1/-1 counters from other creatures when you put them on him. He can also just be a huge 4/5 for 3, which isn't bad. And then we sort of get to more boring places to put the counters, but they are effective. Dune Beetle is one example of this. It has high toughness, so it can absorb -1/-1 counters, usually from 2 different creatures that put them on things. And it's a 2-mana 1/4, so it can block early against those aggressive decks. After that, we have Naga Vitalist and Giant Spider. Now, I realize the Vitalist doesn't have the highest toughness, but it's just such a good card, and I've had a lot of matches where I have like Crocodile of the Crossing and Baleful Amit, and can play them on turn 3 or 4, and put a counter on the Vitalist who helps me ramp it out there. And then it's really not going to be as good in a deck where you don't have the cards that only put one -1/-1 counter. But when you do have those, it's quite good because it can still stick around and do basically all you need it to do anyway, which is produce mana as a 0/1. And so that's a nice place to put it. Giant Spider is just sort of a big dumb guy with high toughness who doesn't hurt to put -1/-1 counters on. And remember, you can put -1/-1 counters on anything. I'm just talking here about sort of more synergistic places to put them. And the final card I have is Awashra Cultivator. I don't recommend playing this card unless you're splashing an off-color bomb. But if you are, it's not a bad place to put -1/-1 counters. So that does it for sort of the places for you to put -1/-1 counters. Now let's talk about some of the payoffs for -1/-1 counters. We're going to talk about cards that can remove -1/-1 counters, cards that like -1/-1 counters. Again, we've already seen some of these like Soul Stinger and Defiant Greatmaw. So now let's just look at the cards we haven't talked about yet that fit particularly well into this deck. And I'm again going to talk about them in order of how good I think they are. So sort of the first tier, and these two cards are both great in this deck, are Quarry Hauler, which is great because it can remove a -1/-1 counter from your creature that came into play with one. It can add -1/-1 counters to your opponent's creatures if you put them on your opponent's creatures. And it also can do stuff with brick counters on occasion and even loyalty counters. It actually can do a number of things. And I have it first mostly just because it's the best. It's better in a vacuum than the rest of these cards are. A 4-mana 4/3 is fine, and then the extra upside it gives you is great in this deck. Nest of Scarabs, though, is sort of the ideal card to get for this deck. If you have 10 or more ways of putting -1/-1 counters on things, especially cards that put multiple -1/-1 counters on things, Nest of Scarabs gets to be incredibly powerful. It is a very strong build around. It's hard to make work, though, so I'm not usually happy to first pick it unless it's a very weak pack, because this is the only color pair where you're really going to get there with Nest of Scarabs, and if it's not open, you're just not going to be able to play it. But if you can play it, it's going to be one of the most important cards in your deck because it just makes insect tokens all over the place. Now, there are two more cards that put -1/-1 counters, or deal with -1/-1 counters. One of them is Shed Weakness. It's a decent combat trick in general. 1 mana for +2/+2 is kind of what we expect from combat tricks these days. But if you have a creature who has -1/-1 counters on it, it can just turn into Giant Growth and give that creature +3/+3, making it an even bigger combat trick than it is in other decks. And then there's Hapatra's Mark, which I think is basically unplayable, sadly. It can remove all -1/-1 counters from a creature, and it gives your creature hexproof, but neither of those is really going to be worth a card most of the time. You have to wait for your opponent to sort of play into it to get any value out of it, and that's why I don't really like Hapatra's Mark. Now, let's talk about rares that do things with -1/-1 counters. So, the two strongest are Archfiend of Ifnir, which is good in any black deck, but obviously being able to put tons of -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures is insane. If you ever get to put Nest of Scarabs into play and Archfiend of Ifnir and you cycle a card, it's just insane. And then there's also Hapatra, who's sort of a signpost rare. We talked about the signpost uncommon, Decimator Beetle, but Hapatra's sort of the signpost rare, and she is very, very powerful. She, like Nest of Scarabs, generates a creature every time you make a -1/-1 counter, no matter where you put it, on your opponent's creatures or on your own. Though she does only make one at a time, the creature she makes has Death Touch, which is very, very powerful. Plus, she can make her own -1/-1 counters if she can get in for damage. So these two are the best rares. All four of the rares we're going to talk about, though, that fit best into this archetype are first pickable, powerful rares. Maybe Hapatra a little less so, just because if you can't play both colors, it's not that good. So we're sort of assuming you're locked into black-green, and then Hapatra gets to be sort of the second best card for your deck, basically, after Archfiend of Ifnir. So the other two rares are Channeler Initiate and Plague Belcher. These two both come into play with -1/-1 counters. They do what a lot of the cards we've looked at so far have done. Channeler Initiate can remove counters from itself, so it's actually good in a number of ways. It can be a 2-mana 3/4 and just kill a Doom Dissenter or whatever, or you can play it on turn 2 and use it to ramp into bigger creatures. And you can also use it as a place to put -1/-1 counters because she can just turn them into mana, and that's pretty powerful. And then you also have Plague Belcher, who's another very strong, undercosted, powerful creature who puts -1/-1 counters on things when it comes into play. But again, if you're playing a deck, say you played turn 2 Doom Dissenter, turn 3 Plague Belcher, it's not an impossible thing to do. I've seen it done. I've done it myself a lot. It's very powerful. A 5/4 who, by the way, you also just made a zombie token, so the extra zombie synergy matters. With a 5/4 with Menace on turn 3 is insane, and if your opponent can't kill it, they're probably just going to die. So that does it for this particular color pair and for this archetype guide. To sort of sum up, black-green really likes -1/-1 counters. It has really powerful and interestingly designed creatures that put -1/-1 counters on themselves or on other creatures. It has good places to put those counters, whether it is simply a creature with high toughness, creatures who like -1/-1 counters, or a creature like Doomed Dissenter who does something for you when it dies. It also has a few build-around cards for -1/-1 counters, and the ideal versions of this deck have 10 or more ways of putting -1/-1 counters into play, and the best ones are repeatable ones like Decimator Beetle, and things like Nest of Scarabs is sort of a crucial card to sort of make this deck come all the way together. It's sort of the glue that keeps it together. If you want to see a deck like this in action, in the description below, I will make sure to include a link to a 3-0 black-green -1/-1 counter draft that I recorded below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. In the comments, let me know what other archetypes you want me to cover, and if you want to make sure you catch more of my limited content, you can subscribe here, where you'll also find content that covers basically all of Magic from other content creators, and you can subscribe to my channel too, where I post a draft video and a crackback every week that's over on NizzahonMagic. Thanks for watching.